Our next speaker, we talked about policy. He's advancing efforts on the European level. Tadeusz Hawrot is the founder and the executive director of PAREA, the Psychedelic Access and Research European Alliance, and he leads the organization's efforts to advance research and promote access to psychedelic therapies across Europe. He drives initiatives that bridge science, policy, and public health. Please welcome Tadeusz Hawrot.
Thank you. Also setting a timer. Whoops, it's sliding. Okay, already lost 15 seconds. Okay, so this is the title of my presentation, and I think, in all these discussions we are asking ourselves a question. It's all great, but when finally the psychedelic therapies will be available legally, as part of maybe healthcare delivery, and maybe more often than not, the answers to these questions that we get are not very straightforward and kind of clear. And I will show in my slides why, and also a bit of a spoiler alert. Probably will not see psychedelic therapies implemented and regulated in Europe anytime soon. I'm afraid we are still some years ahead, most likely. So first, about PAREA. So PAREA stands for Psychedelic Access and Research European Alliance. By the way, at the end, I will have a QR code, so if you want, you will be able to download the slides. So PAREA, as psychedelics, is also a Greek word, and it's in Greece, it denotes this concept of coming together, kind of togetherness, companionship, community. So that's what PAREA in Greek means. We are in Europe, so I'm kind of drawing on our cultural traditions here. And you can see here our members. There are kind of three layers. First and foremost, EU-wide patient organizations such as Pain Alliance Europe, GAMIAN, or Global Alliance for Mental Illness Advocacy Networks, the neurology patient group, because there is also a lot of early research in some neurological conditions. Then we have professional organizations, medical societies like European Psychiatric Association, European College of Neuropsychopharmacology, Association of European Cancer Leagues, speaking about the palliative care, and then a number of some of the leading psychedelic foundations in Europe. We also have associate partners and industry partners and community supporters, and I'm pleased that PSBE is one of our community supporters, and the work that PSBE is doing, I think, is really, really important. So very well done, and also with this meeting. So this is PAREA. We are focusing on the future prescription use within the kind of formal healthcare delivery, assuming that that's how we can reach the biggest amount of people, especially the type of people that will not necessarily go to retreats or go, to kind of therapists that are more underground, and also because we hope that in the future these treatments will be reimbursed. So it's all about building a meaningful access. This is the executive team. We'll actually have our first General Assembly. Although we were set up 3 years ago, we'll now have elections to the board, so this will be kind of expanded in December. And so I will speak about some of the work we are doing in Brussels, and this will not necessarily be directly about psychedelics, but I hope that the next slides will show you a little bit what kind of policy levers we can pull so that we can create a more favorable, conducive environment to psychedelic treatments. Well, I am in Brussels. By the way, I am Polish. I'm currently based in Portugal, but on my way to Portugal, I spent 10 years in Brussels, so it's always nice to be back. And, I guess you know a thing or two about the EU institutions here, but we have three main kind of institutions that have legislative and executive power: the European Commission, the Council of the EU representing member states, and the European Parliament. And by the way, we have what we call a members of the European Parliament action group on psychedelic medicines, which we are just re-establishing after the elections. If you know any Belgian MEPs that could be interested, please let me know. These institutions come up with laws, and there is also the European Medicines Agency, which is an agency of the European Commission, and it has this, it's called a central regulatory approval mechanism. It's the EMA that is, I'll use the name EMA for the European Medicines Agency. EMA is approving drugs, and once they are approved at the kind of EU level, then they could be, technically speaking, accessible in all the countries. But as you will see soon, it's not that straightforward. So this is a bit of a kind of a journey towards access, and psychedelic therapies will follow the same journey. So we speak a lot about FDA, EMA, but after the regulatory approval, there are still a lot of stages. So the access will be contingent on whether the pharmaceutical company will decide to market a given new treatment in a new country, whether the country will have negotiations with this company, and they will kind of arrive at some compromise in terms of pricing and reimbursement, then whether the local pharmacy will have a treatment and whether the patient can afford whatever a person has to pay in addition to what's covered by the insurance. But at a very basic level, access to medicines is of course conditional on development of suitable treatments, and this is substantially shaped by how the market is rewarding and incentivizing innovation. And this is a really important stage before we go anywhere else, because we are not really performing that well in terms of innovation for mental health treatments in general. We know that there has been this stagnation for decades in terms of innovation in mental health, and this is just an example in Europe from the last 3 years, where we've seen 89 new medicines, for instance, recommended last year, and just 1 for psychiatry. And if you look at 3 years back in EU, there were 68 oncology treatments approved and 1 psychiatric. So we really need to think harder how to attract more innovation in the space, and as we do, psychedelic therapies would surely benefit. There are many reasons for this. One is that brain is really a complex organ, so it's just difficult to do research, and there is much more risk, and the R&D in this space in CNS is much more expensive. And this is just an example of, so you can see here phase 1 trials by a type of a therapeutic indication, and the percentage of trials that get approved. So in psychiatry, it's maybe 7%, and there are not many psychiatric treatments that are in the pipeline, in the development. So we've seen that effective policies can really move the needle in terms of attracting innovation to different areas. We've seen this with pediatric medicines, with rare diseases, and now with antimicrobial resistance. And PAREA is lobbying in Brussels with the EU institutions to create this more favorable environment to catalyze innovation in mental health. Currently, the EU is doing a revision of their pharma legislation package, which hasn't been revised for 20 years. So we are trying to affect this process through things like making the case that there should be more incentives given to mental health. What we see now is, and this is because of a lack of incentives, but also because here you can see some unflattering transatlantic comparisons, we are losing, in a way, the kind of innovation edge that we had for a long time. We are losing to America, we are losing to China. You can see some statistics here. And all this is doing, in our area concretely, is doing, is having a one concrete effect, that is all the main companies that are developing psychedelic treatments are prioritizing the US, not Europe. And so there are no approvals in sight at the moment. Actually, kind of the approvals are only moving away even in the US. First, as you probably are aware of, I think it was referenced earlier, FDA rejected an application for FDA rejected an application for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD earlier this year. And about a week ago, the second company, kind of in line, Compass, announced that they'll have a 1-year delay with their phase 3 trials, and that's for US, and we don't even know when, if at all, anytime soon they will want to market, do trials and apply for approval in Europe. So perhaps 2028 in the US for Compass, and maybe for a couple of other companies like Usona or MindMed, and then after that Europe, hopefully. And this is a map just showing the sale volumes again. You know, that's what the companies are looking at when they are making their kind of decisions on the priority regions to invest. Then the next stage is the authorization. So that's what we discuss a lot in the psychedelic phase, in the psychedelic space. Again, FDA, EMA. Here, of course, psychedelics will have to adhere to general standards of drug development, showing the positive risk-benefits ratio. There are challenges also in Europe with clinical trials. We just spoke with the chief medical officer of EMA earlier this week, and again, we discussed placebo a lot, the role of therapy. So we see these challenges across the board globally. One extra requirement is that a certain percentage of trials should happen in Europe to lead to the approval. So that's the authorization. Then we have market placement and pricing and reimbursement. So this is a bit up to companies to apply. They can choose, and unfortunately, often they choose the kind of the biggest economies first in Europe when they roll out new treatments. And you can see a concrete example here. This is showing time from central approval, so time from the European Medicines Agency approval to the actual availability for patients in a given country, and it's shown in days. So you have Germany, for instance, with 128 days on average, of course, and then, you know, on the other side of the spectrum, countries like Poland and Bulgaria, and see Belgium somewhere in the middle with 546 days, I think. Another way of measuring it is how many new therapies are reaching patients at all. So you see here, again, Germany at the beginning, and there is like a 90% variance between the best performing countries and the worst performing countries. So, you know, even if psychedelics are approved by EMA, it will not automatically translate to access. And I think there is a lot that you can do, for instance, in Belgium with you know, the Psychedelic Society to already kind of preempt certain discussions and proactively engage with policymakers so that they, you know, make sure that the therapies, the psychedelic therapies are approved soon after the central approval. And one of the reasons beyond the companies prioritizing certain markets is, of course, the national variation in healthcare spending. It's, you know, only natural that companies will go to Germany that is spending 10% of their GDP on healthcare compared to, you know, some countries spending below 5%. So this is a big issue for EU, because we should have kind of central mechanism. There is a common market, and yet such big inequalities. And this is why, as I mentioned, there is this revision of pharmaceutical legislation happening. On one hand, it's meant to address inequalities, on the other, attract more innovation to Europe and address unmet medical needs, because often companies are prioritizing the therapeutic areas that will give them the most, benefit, rather than areas where there are real unmet medical needs or societal needs. And surely mental health is one such area where the unmet needs are very big and there is very little interest. So for instance, at PAREA, we just met in October with 5 health attaches from 5 different countries proposing concrete amendments to the pharmaceutical legislation, legislative text, somehow creating that are supposed to create better chances for mental health in these new rules. So that's pharma legislation. One thing that I want to mention is that there is this thing called launch conditionality that is introduced until now. So this is a lot is happening on the slide, but one very concrete way of attracting companies is offering them this regulatory data protection, which is currently at 8 years. And the Commission wants to cut it to 6 years, and then companies could recoup 2 additional years if they file for their new treatments to be approved in all member states, not just the ones that they select. So that's one way of kind of modulating incentives to improve access. And I also want to spend just a couple of minutes on explaining how companies can be incentivized. So you have these different stages in the drug development. The first stage is R&D. That's where all the psychedelic companies are, and that means that they are not making any money, the first stage. Then technically speaking, after the regulatory approval, you have the intellectual property protection, and then where you kind of start to recoup the investment. And then as the generic competition comes, it kind of declines. So there are different ways of encouraging companies to prioritize, for instance, Europe. One is adding more time before they lose exclusivity. The other way is making the approvals faster. For instance, now EMA takes almost twice as much time as the US regulator in terms of assessing the application for new treatments. So this could be reduced. And the last one is payment policies. For instance, in mental health, say countries would agree to reimburse psychotherapy, and that's the way of increasing interest of companies in this sense. And then we have health technology assessment, which is an additional layer. So at the level of the kind of EMA and regulating the treatments, we are looking at risk-benefit assessment. But with health technology assessment, it's no longer just about the scientific or about clinical assessment, but it's about efficiency. So it's taking into account financial and economic constraints, because every healthcare system, of course, has resources that are limited by definition. And for instance, if there is a new therapy coming, a country might have a choice whether, for instance, reimburse 1,000 knee replacements or one expensive therapy, gene therapy. So there are these difficult decisions that need to be made because of the scarce resources. So there are questions of kind of prioritization. Another issue is, and this will be also very relevant to psychedelic therapies, is whether positive results from trials will actually translate to the real-world practice, because clinical trials are highly artificial settings, and there is this question of what's called external validity. So that's what the health technology assessment is looking at. And then comparing the new therapy to the best standard of treatment at the moment, and looking whether the additional cost of new intervention would be proportional to the additional benefit. So we can even have efficient treatments which might be affordable, but either you have a large pool of patients or a cost per unit is very high, and the health technology assessors can still say this therapy is too expensive and will not approve it. And we see, for instance, esketamine, Spravato, it hasn't been still approved in, or is not reimbursed in the majority of the EU countries, and NICE in the UK also again rejected a couple of applications. So there will be also this level, and this will be really important, because we know that psychedelic therapies, they require significant amount of resources, because it's not just kind of a drug that is being given, but there is whole therapeutic package around that. And just to mention that at the moment, in a couple of months, the HTA regulation will be coming into force, which will streamline the assessment. So one other problem that the companies are facing, and this is why they are so reluctant to invest in Europe, is that it's very fragmented. In the US, you have just one market, and in Europe, you have like 27 different member states and 27 health technology assessments that they have to prepare. So there is this EU collaboration to somehow streamline at least the clinical assessment in terms of HTA. And the last level is distribution and supply and cost. So patient access will still not flow naturally from the successful conclusion of a price and reimbursement negotiations. And again, this will be very relevant to psychedelic therapies, because we need to build capacities that mirror those in other healthcare professionals. Will need to develop expertise, will need to develop infrastructure, other therapists will need to be trained. And this is also one of the things that PAREA is kind of engaging the EU regulators with. As it was mentioned at the earlier panel, it's not exactly possible for now to have some kind of certification in psychedelic therapies that could be then, kind of acknowledged. So we'd like to develop common standards, and we think that this is both for training therapies, for credentialing, for the way that psychedelic therapies are developed, and we think that this should be developed through an expert consensus of groups that have already well-established experience in terms of developing clinical guidelines. And this work is actually starting this month, because there is a EU-funded project. This is the first EU-funded project for psychedelics that was launched this year. It will be a clinical trial with psilocybin for life-limiting conditions or palliative care. So the main component of this project is a clinical trial, but there is also a work package which will look at standardizing psychedelic therapy, and this work is just starting. It's being led by the European Psychiatric Association. So this is just to let you know that something is kind of moving slowly, but hopefully through this project we would start coming up with some EU standards at the EU level that then could create more certainty in terms of people doing training, and then having some degree of certainty that this would be recognized in the future. And we also hope that things like training will be integrated into standard psychiatry and psychology training programs in the future. And finally, this is my last slide. Hopefully there could be also other ways earlier to have some limited access to psychedelic therapies. Canada was mentioned, Switzerland, Australia, and there are kind of legal possibilities in the EU to have these early access programs, which are these pathways to access for investigational treatments that are not yet approved. They are still somewhere in the process of clinical trials. And one example is compassionate use programs. My understanding is that this is something that you've been exploring here in Belgium. The challenge is that so there EMA is providing some overall frames for this, but then it's up to every single country what are the rules for these programs. And there was an attempt to do something in the Netherlands lately. The Dutch and the EMA State Commission was mentioned, and the Commission recommended naturalistic studies, which would differ a bit from clinical trials. Maybe there wouldn't be like a placebo arm, and there could be an opportunity to collect real-world evidence, but it looks like the government doesn't have an appetite for this type of clinical research, and they will fund something, but it will be still more in the framework of a classical clinical trial. But it is our belief at PAREA that these programs could be really valuable. One reason is because they could facilitate the smoother transition of psychedelic therapies from clinical trials to the actual clinical practice. And also, gradual rollout would have this advantage that we could have a stepwise approach, slowly and organically developing expertise, and it would be less of a shock to healthcare professionals, and we could incorporate elements of psychedelic practice rather than waiting until systems are ready to incorporate everything, so we could start earlier and it wouldn't be so binary. So we are trying to engage with the European Medicines Agency. One possibility could be what's now being prepared in the pharma legislation called regulatory sandboxes, where there could be like a space for a bit of an experimentation with lowering certain requirements that are now imposed for all the treatments. So this is something that PAREA is exploring, and hopefully we could have maybe some EU-wide sandbox where some countries could join and start providing some kind of access before this central regulatory approval. So yeah, that's it. It's been quite technical. Thanks for staying awake until now. And again, you can download the slides here. I hope that the barcode will work. Thank you.
Thank you, Tadeusz, for staying well within your time frame. So there is room for 11 questions.
All right, let's start counting. Yeah, so whoever wants to start, please.
Seems like the problem is not so much the development of a medicine, because the medicines exist. They exist in the underground, we all can get to them, but more like the practitioners who are afraid to lose their license or even suffer legal consequences. And I would say that the most fitting trajectory would be that, the PSBE would actually ask somebody who wants to be the guinea pig for it and offer a lawyer for the inevitable chess legal game that ensued. So that would be, I think, the fastest way to get this show on the road.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I know that, for instance, in Canada, there were quite some legal battles, especially when it comes to compassionate use. But one thing that I'm hearing from, especially from countries and from payers, is that they will not want to see any special treatment being given to psychedelics, unfortunately, and they want to see, all the rigorous trials being followed, and at least this will be, I guess, required for a reimbursement, whether there could be some other legal way of practicing, just like with early access programs is one thing, but if we want to achieve reimbursement of these therapies, then it will have to go through this lengthy process.
I understand that that's the case for reimbursement, but if it's what we're looking after is not being persecuted, then that's, I think, is a whole other matter, and I would be interested in knowing who is dealing with this in the field.
Well, there are UN conventions which Europe is, just like the whole world, kind of subjected to. So the trouble now is that the psychedelics are in the class 1 of the 1971 UN Convention on Psychotropic Substances, and it only permits the use of psychedelics in scientific research or clinical trials. So that's I think the main challenge still legally. It's the most restrictive category.
No, somebody else.
Okay, I think we should take a bit of haste because something strange happened in the US last Tuesday. So when the Trump administration takes over, RFK Jr. says FDA war on public health is about to end. This includes its aggressive suppression of psychedelics, peptides, blah, blah, blah. But because the FDA is going to do a sellout, I don't know how the EMA is going to kind of get into a dialogue on that point and to take that into account that the FDA is going to change really rapidly. So, and because the EMA is conservative, because we have a social security system, but we will have to address this sellout of the FDA in that way.
Well, one thing is what they say before the elections. Let's see what actually turns out, but let's see what kind of pacts with the devil will be happening in the US. I think there is still a sense that kind of there is a FDA supremacy over EMA, and EMA is kind of much slower and looks at FDA. I don't know what would happen if the Lykos would get their approval for MDMA. Even then, probably EMA would want to have phase 3 trials here, and they explain it by saying that first of all, it's a European population, so they want some trials at least to happen here, and they are also asking for reimbursement again for kind of comparative trials. But yeah, I mean, let's see what happens in the US. For now, it was one kind of failure after the other. Now we had the Massachusetts vote. So earlier, the FDA decision, Compass also. So after 2024, that was 2024. That was rather challenging. I hope that there will be something moving there.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah. Can I? You mentioned incentives for companies. You also mentioned the value for money, the net benefit. Does PAREA have an idea of? Do you have like projective numbers of based on clinical trials today of what it could save in terms of the healthcare system, and is there an incentive for the governments to get behind and not for the private sector specifically?
So there were some calculations done in the US in terms of the cost-benefit ratio for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. There are some very early estimates. I mean, whatever estimates you will read, they will look optimistic, but yeah, that's not somehow how the payers see it. And from what we hear now, it will be tricky. And the way they will be maybe willing to somehow give a chance to psychedelics is starting with treatment-resistant conditions. For instance, they don't want to hear about maybe major depressive disorder, but treatment-resistant depression perhaps, or treatment-resistant PTSD. But you need very expensive and thorough cost effectiveness analysis. I know that Compass is thinking that to show these numbers in Germany, they will need to invest up to 100 million euros additional money to do a comparative trial. So that's the degree of challenge that we are facing.
I don't know okay. So since you were talking about the cost of implementing such a study, you were referring before to this European-funded palliative care study where you're thinking of standardizing the psychedelic-assisted therapy. How much in that specific case it is allocated to the training and to create the infrastructure, and can that be capitalized over? Because I guess that once it is there, there's no need for restarting from scratch.
Mm-hmm. So just to maybe say a few words about this project, it's called PsyPal. There are 4 conditions where, so that these are life-limiting conditions. There is multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, ALS, and pulmonary disease. So this is 6.5 million euros that is coming from the coffers of the European Union. The majority of these funds will go to the clinical trial. Some are spent, it's not something that is very resource demanding to start moving towards this standardization. So yeah, we will see. I mean, the idea is really to start something. And I also want to mention that this is unofficial, but in 2025 calls of Horizon Europe, which is this EU framework for research and innovation, there is a call that someone told me at the European Commission was written for us. So there will be another opportunity in 2025 to have one more clinical trial funded by EU, and there we want to actually involve EMA in the consortium. We want to involve regulators in the consortium so that we work together on things that are relevant to the rollout, such as standards. So this is something that will continue over the next few years, standardization work.
If I could have just one more question. As the psychedelic regulation is being rolled out in certain parts of the world, parts of the USA, Australia, do we have already lessons learned from these jurisdictions to see what works, what doesn't work, so that we can take it on the European level?
Mm-hmm. Well, my main lessons from places like Switzerland and Australia is the value of gradual, slow rollout, of starting somewhere, gathering real-world data, and starting to build this infrastructure. So for me, there is a lot of value in that. Unfortunately, we cannot exactly have the Australian model in the EU as such, because again, every country has a different legislation, so it has to be country by country. So that's a challenge, but it would be possible. It would be possible for Belgium to start something, for instance.
Thank you very much, Tadeusz.